Eric Fraser was born in the borough of Westminster in London in 1902. His father worked as a solicitor's clerk and his mother was a teacher, and his early interest in drawing and painting led him to attend evening classes from the age of 14 at Westminster School of Art. In 1919 he was awarded a scholarship to London's Goldsmiths School of Art, but even as a student he was taking professional illustration commissions of various kinds. He also had some early success as an artist, creating limited edition prints and occasional paintings. Once he had graduated, he managed to secure some part-time work as an art teacher to augment his income, and simultaneously tried with reasonable and steadily increasing success to widen his client base by taking commissions for fashion magazines alongside other editorial work. Among the images he was producing at this time, there were some examples of quirky humorous illustrations for magazines I couldn't name, as well as book cover design and odds and ends of press advertising, all of which could be generally described as Art Deco in their visual approach. In 1925, Fraser married Irene Lovett and they moved to Twickenham, and during their marriage they produced 4 children. From there he commuted daily to his studio in the capital, where the vast majority of his clients were based. Fraser had a strong working knowledge of print processes and a similar understanding of traditional craft-based ways to render his images, such as lithography, wood engraving and scraperboard. But he only employed such processes some of the time, and was just as likely to replicate them with the use of pen, ink and occasionally more textural mediums. In the later years of the decade, Fraser first began his professional association with the BBC's Radio Times magazine, and this would later become a symbiotic relationship which would last until his eventual death. Up to this point his commercial work had been almost exclusively black and white, but in 1928 he produced his first colour poster, a highly abstracted but cheerful composite image for London transport. In the same year he created another Art Deco style but more figurative image promoting the idea of life in the more rural Welwyn Garden city, from where you could commute to your job in the capital. At this time it was undoubtedly magazine work created in both monochrome and less frequently colour that was dominant in his output, and he persisted with both fashion illustration and occasional forays into whimsically humorous material for any number of British publications of the period. Among other commissions, as the 1930s began, he produced this strikingly symmetrically composed poster for the 1930 Football Cup final for the London Underground Railway, a commission which brought him to a far wider audience than usual and helped advance his career considerably. It was also in 1930 that he was commissioned to create the character known as Mr. Therm as a mascot for the gas board. And although Fraser's design wasn't the most accessible or likeable of mascots, it was a particularly successful and enduring one, which was used extensively for the next 30 years and appeared in all manner of promotional formats. In 1935 the Fraser family settled in the suburb of Hampton by the River Thames, and he set up his studio at the end of the back garden, which freed him of the onerous commute into the city, although he was still obliged to deliver artwork on completion. By the middle of the decade, Fraser had become, if not ubiquitous, certainly a familiar feature of all aspects of the media in Britain. And as well as now previously unexplored territory such as book jacket design, he continued to create press advertising and appear in various magazines while strengthening his ongoing relationship with the Radio Times. In 1937 his illustrated edition of Tolkien's The Hobbit was published, and the images he produced for the book were a collection of particularly stylised and geometrically informed pen drawings, again deliberately intended to resemble wood engravings. They were actually more of what could be called page decoration rather than actual illustration, which usually carries with it at least the implication of an emotional dimension. Consequently, these highly stylised images could have been far more emotive, as much of his narrative work for fiction testified. Even so, this arguable triumph of style over content didn't seem to adversely affect the book's success. Fraser continued to be diverse in his stylistic approaches and the varied purposes of his outcomes, and with a strong reputation for the quality of his graphic images, in 1939 he was commissioned to create a series of striking composite posters for the post office on the theme of significant moments in the history of communication. But that was also the year the Second World War began, and he became a civil defence warden, more popularly known as Dad's Army. Nevertheless, he also continued to produce illustration, quite a lot of which was naturally enough in support of the war effort, including more striking examples of posters for the post office. And when the war was over in 1945, Fraser was commissioned to create this post-war propaganda poster to get the British public to look forward to a more hopeful future. Stylistically, he was still some considerable distance from the more representational illustration being created by others in Britain, but this only helped to boost his reputation, as he was by this point recognised by many as a pioneer of simplicity, modernity and graphic dynamism, which many felt chimed perfectly with the austere years of a post-war Labour government determined to create more equality. The series of posters for the post office, which had begun during the war, continued as the 1950s came around, and throughout the decade you would have been very hard-pressed to avoid his work grabbing your attention in a number of contexts and printed media. Virtually every issue of the Radio Times, which despite its title was by now also featuring TV programmes, contained at least one Fraser illustration, and he featured regularly on its covers, at this time a coveted commission in British illustration. Book covers appeared in abundance, for which he usually created the whole design including any lettering, and yet more advertising work in monochrome and colour, including this compelling image actually used as an advertisement for a paper company. In 1951 he was commissioned to illustrate an edition of the complete dramatic works of William Shakespeare. He created a large number of typically mannered and formally posed monochrome images featuring the various characters in key moments from the plays. But in this instance it was undoubtedly the colour pages which were the most striking contribution. His images generally avoided the more histrionic, melodramatic visualisations of the plays created by so many others before him, but they nevertheless had emotional eloquence and abundant graphic appeal. The limited palette of flat subdued colours was applied in washes, and whether monochrome or colour, all of them were demonstrations of masterful visual narrative techniques. There was some uncharacteristically frivolous but graphically appealing work for the decoration of greeting telegrams, and some press advertising for Guinness, using the 1951 Festival as Britain as the basis of its humour, which was also quite uncharacteristically whimsical in nature. There were also several impressive illustrated book jacket designs created in the early 1950s, some of which were for fiction, but there was also this medievally rendered composite image for the cover of a book of English legends. Although the visual evidence clearly shows that overtly commercial work was never all that high on Fraser's agenda, at this time he did create a memorable series of black and white press ads for Rolex watches, featuring illustrations of examples of adventurous exploration with which to associate the brand's reputation for reliability and indestructibility. The connection may have been tenuous at best, but it was nevertheless an evocatively drawn campaign. And he continued to appear in all forms of the media with magazine work, posters for the post office, and yet more for the Radio Times. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, and he was commissioned to design this commemorative plate for the occasion, now of course somewhat of a collector's item. Even though it was the 1950s, the media landscape in Britain remained predominantly monochrome, but that was no obstacle for Fraser, who had shaped his own graphic talents primarily in black ink. But he still had a reasonably large number of opportunities to work in colour, such as this striking painted work for Courier magazine in 1954, which revealed a more overtly illustrated, less graphic aspect of his talents. During the remainder of the 1950s, Fraser continued to be active in most of the areas available to the illustrator. But other than occasional forays into advertising, it was predominantly book cover design and book illustration that were his primary outcomes. Among others, he illustrated a particularly engrossing collection of trademark angular monochrome woodcut pastiches for an edition of the 1001 Arabian Nights, published by the Folio Society. And although formally rendered with their decorative aspects well to the fore, they nevertheless captured human emotion with success. 1960 was a particularly productive year for Fraser, and his illustrated work, much of it now in colour, was truly ubiquitous in virtually every illustrated arena imaginable. Among other highlights was this wraparound educational book cover and an equally memorable and aesthetically considered poster promoting rail travel to the historic city of Bath. But arguably the most striking images he created in that year were for the book with the outrageously long title Sir William and the Wolf and Other Tales from the Days of Chivalry, written by John Hampden. And although there were numerous monochrome spot illustrations created for the book, it was undoubtedly the colour pages, similar to his earlier Shakespeare volume, which were the most engrossing visual aspect. In this instance, they were actually tonally painted renders, probably but not necessarily in gouache. Fraser's expected formality of design and layout made an odd but pleasing juxtaposition with the outlandish nature of the subjects and their more naturalistic render. In that year, he used the same painted technique for the cover of a promotional brochure for the fishing industry, with similar visual appeal. But in 1961 he returned to monochrome for Tales of the British People by Barbara Leone, and as always the absence of colour was no detriment to the outcome. In 1963 the Folio Society published a translation of A Shameful Revenge and Other Stories by Maria de Sayas y Sotomayor, and the dramatic monochromes Fraser produced for this commission were particularly fine examples of the potency of his angular but emotionally charged woodcut influenced technique to evoke the essence of this kind of intense classic fiction with apparent ease. And consequently this visual dimension invariably enhanced the book's value as an object to be treasured by collectors, who would happily pay far more than was usual in more mainstream publishing for the general public. In 1964 he designed the cover and produced page monochromes for the book Pioneers in Astronomy, written by Navin Sullivan. But that was just one of the diverse commissions he continued to undertake, and alongside it there were various others, such as this wine list cover and a particularly attractive image of Henry VIII for a business calendar. And of course he was still putting in appearances in the pages and on the covers of the Radio Times. In 1965 he also created a collection of monochromes for an edition of the ancient Greek saga of Jason and the Golden Fleece, and his mannered semi-silhouetted figures were the perfect visual accompaniment to the heroic text. The Folio Society's edition of Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed, originally written in 1827, was published with Fraser illustrations in 1969. And this was another serious and somewhat obscure work of literature, which was like a harmful revenge marketed to collectors of fine illustrated books, which fetched higher than usual prices. But from Fraser's perspective this was of little concern, and as always he simply set himself the task of creating the most telling and visually compelling illustrations, and did so with manifest success. In 1971, Fraser illustrated Ovid's The Art of Love for the Limited Editions Club, another publisher which prided itself on the desirability and undoubted qualities of the books it published. This ancient Roman work on the theme of the more physical aspects of human relationships provided Fraser with ideal material to create two-colour illustrations of considerable dignity. It seems that now at the age of 70 he was starting to slow down, and it wasn't until 1977 that he contributed to what I can only describe as an ill-advised Folio Society edition of The Lord of the Rings. The main credit for this collection went to one Ingehild Grathmer, a pseudonym for the Danish Queen Margarita II, and Fraser was no more than a pair of hands used to make her drawings presentable in print. 4 years later he indicated what this might have been when he created his own far more appealing colour image of the Lord of the Rings on the cover of the Radio Times to promote the 1981 BBC radio drama adaptation. This was the last dated work I could find, but it's asserted by the sources I used that Eric Fraser was still working from his back garden studio, even up to the week before his death in 1983, when he was 81 years old. As I'm sure you can tell from some of my less favourable comments, there are still some aspects of his work that I struggle to get on board with. For me, Fraser's work on Tolkien's books, and Mr. Thurm in particular, are just too mannered and lacking in emotion to have much appeal. Nevertheless, I'm glad that one of the very few benefits of old age is that I'm now capable of being far less tribal about my likes and dislikes than in my youth. And I hope that at least some of you can follow me down this particular avenue and find many of his images visually rewarding.